Okay, Ricky, so which data-related techniques are commonly used by the anti-gun lobby and the government in its supporting documents, and why does this not work? So that's my first part.
Okay.
Please also refer to your critique on the 5 research papers,
Okay.
if we can just touch on that as
Sure.
well.
I think first let's unpack this notion of the anti-gun lobby,
Yes.
okay, and sort of maybe this will give some further motivation as to why I structured my paper the way that I did. The anti-gun lobby sort of has 3 components, and we'll start from the bottom and we'll work our way up. At the bottom are these academic researchers. Okay, so
Yes.
this is going to be, if you read the authors, Matsopoulos,
Yes.
Matthews, Abrahams, Jukes, etc. The majority of these researchers come either from the Medical Research Council or the University of Cape Town
All
or
in
UNISA.
that area, if you look at
Yeah.
the sort of the Cape Flats.
Yeah. It's, you know, I understand the motivation for their research. I don't have any doubt that it's not well intentioned, you know, but there's a problem with it, which we'll get into later. There's lots of problems with it, but I think just at a high level, a lot of people in medical research and doctors, there's 2 things. Firstly, they're not policy analysts. Okay, when you're writing a research paper where you're trying to understand the relationship between stricter firearm control and homicides, doctors see the homicides.
They say they see the bad end.
They see the bad end. They are the guys who have to work 36-hour shifts, who probably are not getting paid properly, especially if they're working for state hospitals. They're under-resourced, they are underpaid, they're overworked. But they're not policy analysts. They see one side, and I think that their motivation is to say, well, how can we reduce the pain that we see on a daily basis? I don't think that it is nefarious in any way, or that they have a political agenda.
Especially from the Children's Hospital and stuff like
Yeah.
that, which comes out with the anti-gun lobby quite a
Yes,
lot.
yeah. So actually,
The Red Cross Hospital, I think.
yes,
it is.
so there was a paper, I think that was Campbell 2013, where they used data from the Red Cross Hospital, which I'll try to get onto in a moment. So yeah, I think that, you know, their intentions are good, but they're not policy analysts. So they're not always thinking about the things that we should be thinking about, which is the bigger picture. You know, even if they can show that stricter firearm regulation did result in fewer homicides, they're not thinking about what are the costs of the legislation, what happens if it doesn't work, what are the unintended consequences of it, what rights are being limited. They're not thinking in terms of rationality and reasonableness. They're not thinking in terms of justification. They are trying to test their hypothesis using whatever data is available. And to be quite frank, a lot of their data sets are somewhat incomplete. So that's sort of that's the one group. And like I say, I don't think they have any bad intentions. That research then filters into the next group on the pyramid, which is the mid-level tier, which are the kind of anti-gun organizations, which will be Gun Free South Africa, the Institute of Security Studies, there's a National Prevention Crime Unit, etc. Now, this is where things do get a little bit more tricky. It doesn't appear to me that Gun Free South Africa does their own research. They collate and repackage the academic research. That's why I say the academic research is at the base. They repackage that. The ISS, which is the Institute of Security Studies, they do some of their own research. It's de novo, it's a fresh sort of research. But they are not as anti-gun, I think, as Gun Free South Africa. It is very explicit. Our ISS is probably a little bit more balanced, but I still think there are problems with their research. We can try and touch on that just now. So they repackage all of this stuff. Now there's probably some scope to argue that this is not well-intentioned. The reality, whether we like it or not, is that research doesn't happen in a vacuum. Researchers, even though I said those researchers at the base are probably not, don't have bad intentions, you still, you know, need to get funding, you need to get grants. For example, the 2012 and 2013 papers by, I think, Abrahams and Matthews received funding from the Open Society. Now, you know, which is George Soros' organization, which no longer provides funding for Gun Free South Africa, but it's common cause that the Open Society is not pro-firearm.
Absolutely.
Now, you can say in your paper, as they say, that the funding had no effect on the design of this research, but no man is an island, right? You're getting money from somewhere. It's very unlikely you'll get funding from them again if you're going to come up with a conclusion which is completely against the underlying philosophy. So it's not that you will lie, cheat, and steal, but researchers might be persuaded to try and. It's not that they lie, but they may not tell the full truth, or they might
massage
the figures. Not even the figures, but you massage the conclusions and the recommendations that you draw from the data. So there's the researchers. You've got Gun Free South Africa, and then you've got on top sort of the minister and the Ministry of Police. Now this I find quite interesting because the minister should have access to an immense amount of data. They should be able to gather information on all different types of homicides, different ways that crime is committed using different weapons. You should be able to segment that by demographics, all these kinds of things. They have access to CFR. But I think, as we know and as the Wits report showed, is that a lot of the police data is unreliable.
And there's still issues. I've done reports at police stations just filling in forms, and there's problems with them capturing the stuff. There's just general problems.
Yeah. So there's problems with, the best way to describe it is the accuracy of the data is not quite there. But the point is that the minister it doesn't appear to me that the minister conducts a lot of their own research. They either outsource it, so as they did with the Wits report, or they rely on other third parties, either from institutions like Gun Free South Africa or the ISS, and then those guys get their information from this research, which comes out of the Medical Research Council, University of Cape Town, etc.
And they refer to each other as well, which it's not good science.
Yeah. So it's, I'll try my best to explain this. It's not necessarily bad science, but they do it in a misleading way. Lots of researchers will refer to their peers and will refer to themselves, but then that research has to be credible. The problem that these guys face is that they will say, yes, our research is credible because it's gone into a journal which is peer-reviewed. But the problem is if your peers think the same as you and they write with you and you've all published together and you all refer to each other, then the credibility of the journal is actually under threat. So in a normal setting, I'd say referring to previous work that you've done that's been tested and gone through multiple checking processes and has been critiqued and is in the public sphere and has now become commonly accepted knowledge, I would say that is okay. But when you continuously refer to your own research and your pal's research, who's also judge, jury, and executioner on your research because they may be an editor of a journal, the waters become a bit muddied. So I think that is maybe an additional motivation for my paper, which is if we can address the foundational evidence upon which the Minister and Gun Free South Africa rely on, if that evidence is shown to be flawed, then the conclusions and recommendations flowing from that evidence is going to be flawed. There is another twist to this, if I could put it this way, which is even if that evidence is not flawed, the conclusions and recommendations themselves can also be flawed. Now, this happens quite frequently in research, and it happens because researchers are going to be biased. They want to find an answer to their question.
Yeah, and maybe they've already decided what the answer is and they're trying to get the two together.
Maybe a statistical term for this would be called data mining. So in other words, instead of starting out with a theoretical proposition and then testing it using the data, you go to the data and you let the data dictate to you what the theory should be. And in fact, there's a specific methodology which one of the authors used, which is called a backward stepwise regression, where they build their model not based on sound theory, but instead they use the data to dictate how they should build the model. Now, it's commonly accepted that this is actually a very dangerous approach. And the reason for that is, in simple terms, when you start doing all these tests on the data, they are not independent of one another. And so when you build that model by doing all these different types of tests on the basis of the data alone instead of theory, the confidence that you can have in your conclusions becomes much weaker. Now, I think that was the 2008 paper by Matthews, they note this, which I commend them for noting it up front, but they do not mention that this could be misleading, which I think is another issue with some of these papers, where they haven't really fully addressed some of the assumptions and underlying model building methodologies explicitly. They just, again, they're not doing bad research by ignoring it. They're telling you what they're doing, but good researchers would say this is a problem because of this, and we try to mitigate the risk by doing X, Y, and Z, and they don't do that. So yeah, so I think that's the motivation, right? You've got these three levels, and attacking, I think the foundation is good, but as I say, sorry, back to my original point, which is even if the evidence is good, the conclusions and the recommendations can be bad. So to give you an example, you might find that, kind of go back to our shoe example, right? You might find that stricter firearm regulation did reduce the number of homicides, but it may have only reduced the number of homicides in Cape Town. Does that mean that it's applicable to all of South Africa? Well, maybe not. Cape Town's special, right? There's lots of gang violence there. That's just, maybe a quick example, which is that researchers often draw conclusions which exceed the scope of their data, and they shouldn't. Right? If I only have data about motor vehicle accidents on the N1 highway, I need to motivate why I can draw conclusions about motor vehicle accidents in Durban. I'm talking about the N1 in Johannesburg, right? So you need to, researchers, even if their data is good, the conclusions and recommendations they draw from it should still be tested.
I think there was this one incident which Gun Free South Africa uses, which was in a very small area, and the researcher said it's only this small area,
yeah.
And they've actually extrapolated it to South Africa.
To South Africa,
which is not great, and that's what you're saying.
So I think the researchers, so that bottom tier of the pyramid, are probably less guilty of this data crime. But unfortunately, I think Gun Free South Africa in particular like to read a research paper and pick out the one conclusion which sounds like you've got the icing on top of the cake, and that's what they'll run with. The minister does the same thing in the Ministry of Police report. And that's been probably my biggest critique of the Ministry of Police report, which is that those researchers fail to interrogate their supporting sources. Good researchers, you can't interrogate everything, some papers may have 100 references, you may not be able to read them. I read references, and then I read the references of those references. I tried my best where I had time. But you need to accept that there may be flaws within the underlying research, and you have to note them. And I think, that's definitely where the Ministry of Police went wrong.
They failed.
Yeah, they failed there. So let me get into the data techniques. So I think in sum, let's go again back to this issue of causality, because it's crucial for policy analysis. So what we're trying to do, and I think there's again good research to support this, is that modern policy research attempts to find causal relations. It is not of relevance to find mere association, because as I said, if you're a policy decision maker and you decide to go on policy based on association, your policy decisions are likely to be bad for people. They're likely to be harmful and have costs, etc., etc. So the data techniques that we should be using in order to determine whether policy has been effective in the past should be along those lines. Researchers should try and show that stricter firearm regulation has caused a reduction in homicide, not that it is associated with a reduction in homicide, because of course there could be a third factor that is reducing homicides, which is either related or unrelated to the stricter firearm regulation. So I think this was a key issue in the Matsopoulos paper from 2014. It's definitely important in the Matthews papers, and because there's 2012 and 2013, and Abrahams, and then the Matthews paper from 2008. So let me go through two basic data techniques that they use, and I'll feed in some examples from the papers. So the first data technique, which is quite common, is known as a before and after technique. At its simplest level, what it does is you measure a problem at a point in time, you then apply some sort of intervention, and you then measure the problem after the intervention. Now, that could be a way to attribute cause to the intervention. Okay, so again, let's think of a simple example. This is very common in the medical literature. You're going to try and test whether a medication works. So you measure a patient, you give him medication, you measure him afterwards. Did the medication work? This is a very the benefit of this is that it's very simple to understand because it's just comparing a statistic now and a statistic down the line, and it's very easy to get data. You literally just need a time series. Okay, so data of a variable over time, so before and after. The problem with this is that there could obviously be many other interventions during that period which are not related to the intervention you're trying to measure. So firearm ownership is a good idea here, where you say, well, in Abrahams they say, what was the female homicide rate, femicide in 1999, and what was it like in 2009, and you see it came down. They then say, well, during that period there was stricter firearm regulation, therefore stricter firearm regulation had an impact. It may or may not have had an impact because in 10 years there's many other things that may have changed which would have affected the likelihood of a female homicide.
And that's also, the Wits report also says the whole FIFA's World Cup where there was stricter policing, etc., etc., had an influence, and they didn't take that into consideration.
Exactly. So, and I think that is, so that is the main problem with the before and after, which is that in maybe technical terms, you can't control, this is a word which is commonly used in regression analysis, which is a second technique, is that basic before and after analysis does not control for other intervening factors which may influence the outcome. Okay, so Abrahams does this in the 2012 paper, which is through the Medical Research Council and Open Society, and then they do another paper in 2013 which takes the same paper and just sort of beefs it up a little bit, right? Because what they add to it is a second technique known as regression analysis. So regression analysis can be quite complex, but the benefit of it is that it's very flexible and it takes us a step closer to causality. And why does it do that? Like I was saying earlier, one of the issues with trying to isolate a cause is that there could be many other factors involved.
You don't know
what's what. Regression analysis can help you take care of that. So you can now, instead of just thinking about a before and after, you can think about before and after given a whole lot of other things which also may have impacted the outcome.
Is that what the Wits report did? More regression, or because they looked at all of the other factors that was playing?
So you can look at all these other factors outside of regression analysis.
Okay.
But the regression analysis is a very powerful technique because mathematically it can account for these things and it can give you a little bit more certainty when it comes to cause. Okay, so imagine if we go back to our shoe example with the kids. We were saying that shoe size influences the children's intellectual levels, but there was age, which was the third variable affecting both of them. If we were to put that into a regression and without including age, we would find that there's this relationship. But once we include age in the model, that relationship will disappear because it's actually age that's driving all of this stuff, not shoe size. So regression analysis will, if done correctly, will tell you that. The problem with regression analysis is it requires richer data, so you need more data instead of just the simple time series before and after. You now need data on all the other factors. And it also requires a number of assumptions which need to be made. And if those assumptions don't hold, then you can't be sure of your conclusions. They might be misleading. Now, what I found when reading a lot of the research papers is that only really the Matsopoulos paper, I would say, did a good job of actually trying to account for some of these other factors. There's still problems with that paper, but it was definitely the best of all of them. So, for example, in the Abrahams paper in 2013, when they do this regression analysis, they only include one variable in their model. Now, the problem is that is very similar to the before and after, because you haven't taken into account all these other potential causal factors which might be influencing the outcome. So we can't really be confident in their results. The Matsopoulos paper does go a step further, and it tries to incorporate other causal factors like age, day of the week, etc., etc. But that problem is also flawed. That paper is also flawed. Now, I think I'll try to be as simple as I can on it, but I think probably the two or three of the main problems there is, the first thing is, when we're trying to isolate cause, we have to be quite sure of when that cause started and when it ended. Okay, so for example, if we believe that the FCA only started in 2004 instead of 2000, which is what Matsopoulos argues, then the chances are that you're likely going to attribute more of the work that was actually being done to the FCA because you thought it started earlier. So you thought it started in 2001 and you see these homicides coming down, but actually if it started much later, it means there was something else.
2004.
There was something else that was coming down. And this is actually quite interesting actually about that paper, if I can digress momentarily, which is, when did the FCA 2000 really come into effect? The researchers all claim, again, I give them credit for being honest, they say it started in 2000 and it came into effect in 2004, but there were some aspects of it which were being implemented. But none of them tell me which aspects were being implemented. Because if the aspects that were being implemented were irrelevant, small, tiny little aspects, then yes, those aspects existed before 2004, but the real meat of the work was only being done in 2004, which means that Matsopoulos is likely to overestimate the number of lives that were saved by the FCA. That's the one problem with him, is that with his paper, is that there's no real way to identify, there's no real way to attribute cause to the FCA over his study period, because it's unclear about when the FCA came into effect in his study. So that's the one major issue with his paper. The other major issue with his paper is, again, he does a better job than his academic friends.
Yeah.
And that's related to the causal mechanism. So what he argues is that the data shows this decline in homicide, and he attributes it to the FCA, which we've already said is doubtful, but let's give him the benefit of the doubt, says that's the case. How did it actually work? How did this FCA actually impact? Well, he argues that it impacts because the FCA reduced the number of legal firearms, that reduced the number of thefts and losses, and that is what impacted on the homicide rate. But we've just spoken about this earlier, that if you actually look at the data, firstly, it's ambiguous as to whether the number of legally owned firearms declined from 2001 to 2004. Secondly, the number of lost and stolen firearms, if you actually look at the Wits report, is quite constant over that period. It's not like it suddenly decreased, like massively. It only decreased in the final period. But what's strange is that in that final period, the number of homicides actually went up. So his causal explanation for how the FCA actually worked is not quite there. And there's also a number of other assumptions which he uses, which are also likely to be flawed. And just very quickly, what his problem is that he tries to calculate the number of saved lives by comparing the firearm homicide rate with the non-firearm homicide rate. Now, you can do that, but only under certain assumptions. And in particular, one of these assumptions is known as the parallel trends assumption, which sounds fancy, but what it really means is that if I want to calculate the number of lives lost, the number of lives saved, I need to estimate what would have happened if there was no FCA. And then I compare the two and I calculate the difference. Now he says, well, let's assume that this is the same as the non-firearm homicide rate. But it's questionable as to whether you can actually make that assumption. And I go into a little bit of detail about why that is the case. And if you actually think about that in the context of when the FCA was employed, which was fully in effect in 2004, what that means is if you use his own data, it actually shows you that the parallel trends assumption doesn't hold. He's using the wrong comparison group. Or at least, if we use his own data as an alternative comparison group to measure the number of lives saved, it actually shows that he overestimated the number of lives saved. So I think those are kind of two of the main techniques, before and after and regression analysis. But all of the research papers try to employ them, but sort of come short. Now, what is the implication of this? The primary implication, and you see it in the papers, is that they haven't shown cause, and they've exceeded the bounds of what their data tells them. And they start making inflated claims about the relevance of stricter firearm regulation. you can't look at a simple before and after and then just say, oh, this must be because of the FCA when you haven't shown cause, and then worse, you then make a recommendation to implement stricter firearm regulations. You haven't shown cause, you haven't identified that stricter firearm regulation works, yet you are now here telling us that we should implement even stricter firearm regulation.
Absolutely.
So, like I say, there's kind of like this gradual progression of, is the data good? But even if the data is good, the conclusions and recommendations are inflated and exceed the data. That is, I think, a bit of a summary of sort of what I include. But obviously I've gone into a lot more detail. And I think that, kind of the next step is to think further about this in terms of other papers. Now, the reason I say that is because I know that Matsopoulos has recently published, I think in 2018 or 2019, something similar to what he did in 2014. But he has more data, okay, because now he's got this new data set, which I still believe is incomplete, and the Wits paper notes this because it doesn't include rural data. In fact, I quote 3 different sources, even from Gunfree, even from his own research in 2000, 2001, where he says the current data set, which is the NIMSS data set, or NIMMS data set, only covers 30 to 40% of the population.